Just give it a few minutes because folks start to come in now once they see the notice populating, and we'll start seeing people come into our room. Hello, welcome. We're glad that you're all here. Thank you for being here today. We're going to get started in just a minute. We're going to cover a few housekeeping rules real quick. First of all, we'd like to remind everyone of our commitment to maintain an accountable and safe space. If you need any help with that, please reach out through the messaging and send me a note and I'll make sure and help you out. Remember that the icons that you need to enable the session chat and the Q&A pod are on the vertical bar to the right side of your screen. If you're not seeing it, check and see if your event feed might be blocking it. Just go into that upper right corner of your event feed, click the X, it'll disappear and you should have access to a list of icons on a vertical bar. You'll see people, you'll see speech bubbles and other things. So you'll be able to access all of those that way. Towards the end of the session, I will put a note in the chat reminding everybody to take part in the survey just to let us know how we're doing. When you see that note, you can go and take part in the survey. It's the second to the last icon on that vertical bar, and it's the one that looks like a little checklist. It has some lines and a couple of check marks. If you'll just take a quick minute and take that survey, that would be really helpful to us so that we can continue to improve our offerings as we move forward. To enable us to keep up with the questions for our speakers, we ask that you put your questions in the Q&A pod. It's the third icon on that bar, and we'll be able to keep track of all the questions that you have for our speakers today. So it is now my pleasure to introduce our speakers for this session. We have Abir Sikder, who is the Senior Policy Analyst at the Council of State Governments, where he conducts research and analysis, leading research projects on justice-involved youth and mental health services for delivery. So Abir, we're glad that you're here today. We also have Regina Ann Smith. She's the staff attorney for Disability Rights New Jersey, where she represents children under the age of 21 with disabilities and or mental health diagnoses in a variety of areas. And finally, we have Ruby Kish, a staff attorney also from the Disability Rights of New Jersey. Ruby works to address the education rights of justice-involved youth through direct representation. Her practice focuses on issues of special education, school discipline, and educational rights of incarcerated youth. So without further ado, I'll turn it over to y'all. Ruby, Regina, Abir, the stage is yours.
Thank you so much, Tracy. Good morning or good afternoon, everyone, depending on where you're coming from. Ruby and I are going to kick off our presentation today talking about the K-12 system, but focusing on how we can decriminalize disability and really support youth to dismantle that school to prison or school to confinement pipeline. Disability Rights New Jersey is our state's protection and advocacy agency. There's one in every state. Our mission is to protect, advocate, and advance the rights of persons with disabilities and mental health disorders or diagnoses in pursuit of a society where people with disabilities can exercise self-determination and choice, and they're also treated with dignity and respect. I'm Regina. I'm a white woman sitting in my home office right now with blonde hair and a flower shirt on, and I'll allow Ruby to introduce herself.
Hello, I am Ruby. I am sitting in my living room right now. I am a woman of Middle Eastern origin, and I am wearing a pink shirt with tiny little anchors on it.
Both Ruby and I operate under the Youth Justice Project at Disability Rights New Jersey. The Youth Justice Project focuses on 4 distinct prongs. We provide educational advocacy for youth impacted by the school to prison pipeline. We also offer training and technical and legal assistance to court stakeholders. So that's everyone from the judge to probation officers and people in between. We offer information specifically to public defenders to advocate throughout the stages of their case if they have a youth with a disability. And then we provide testimony and advocacy in court as well. So we're called on as educational or disability witnesses. Today, we hope to cover 4 distinct areas in our half hour together before we turn it over to Abir. We would like to review with you the school to confinement pipeline and then go through our 3 areas of advocacy in court, in the community, and also in the school. So let's start with our school to confinement or school to prison pipeline. The school to prison pipeline is not a one-way street. It's actually a superhighway. Students who struggle academically in school are subject to increased exclusionary discipline and more likely to be impacted by the justice system. Students who are justice impacted are less likely to have positive school outcomes. The school to prison or school to confinement pipeline is defined as much by the school's failure to appropriately educate our students as it is the juvenile or youth justice system's failure to prioritize education of youth within the system. The key to success for justice impacted youth is providing our students or clients, many of whom have encountered significant challenges or barriers, with individualized education supports. Some of the most significant challenges that our youth face are mental health concerns, which can significantly impact their ability to access education. Ruby? Uh-oh, it looks like Ruby.
Oh,
Go ahead, Ruby.
so before we discuss the role that mental health plays in the school to prison pipeline, it's really important that we talk about the disproportionality in our juvenile justice system where youth of color are overrepresented. This disproportionality exists at every level of justice involvement, from arrest to adjudication to confinement. We know that youth of color make up 1/3 of the youth population, but 2/3 of youth within contact of the juvenile justice system. Youth of color are nearly 2 times more likely to be arrested than white youth. And we know that Black children are 2.5 more times as likely to be arrested. So the graphs you're seeing here only represent the youth that are residentially placed, so only a portion of the justice involved youth. And you can see overall that there has been a decline in residential placement across the board, but that disproportionality still exists, particularly between youth, white youth and Black youth, and Native American youth as well. So one thing that is really important that we wanted to stress here is to recognize that this disproportionality is a product of discriminatory policies and practices such as zoning laws, restrictive housing covenants, racial steering by real estate companies, and discriminatory lending policies, all of which have resulted in the segregation of Black and brown families into underfunded communities. Youth growing up in neighborhoods of extreme poverty with low-performing public institutions like schools are more likely to be impacted by the justice system. Additionally, we know that our criminal justice system's violence and inequality towards Black Americans is fueled by a long history of racism that frames Black people as inherently dangerous. So the disproportionality in our juvenile justice system is not limited to race, but also disabilities, specifically behavioral and mental health disabilities. Justice impacted youth are disproportionately diagnosed with mental health and behavioral disorders such as substance use disorder, anxiety disorder, attention deficit hyperactivity disorder, and mood disorders. As many as 70% of youth who are court involved have a diagnosable mental health problem, compared with an estimated 9 to 22% of the general youth population. The rise in mental health issues in the last few years has only exacerbated the pressures on schools to address student needs, and we know from schools that this problem is significant, with 70% of public schools reporting an increase in the percentage of students seeking mental health services since the start of the pandemic, and roughly 76% of schools reporting an increase in staff voicing concerns about students exhibiting symptoms such as depression, anxiety, and trauma. We also have reports from the Centers for Disease Control that 42% of students felt persistently sad or hopeless, and nearly 1/3 experienced poor mental health.
So these issues and problems that our youth face are not just on the entrance into the system and on the way out, the school and confinement, but there are actually a lot of stops along the way. And those stops include the community and the courtroom. So youth with mental health diagnoses need strong advocacy in the community and in the courtroom as well. We don't have time today to really dive deeply into the work that Disability Rights New Jersey does on the community side and the court side, but we will briefly touch on those before heading into the K-12 school system for our youth. So let's look very briefly at the advocacy in court that can happen when you are working with a youth that has been impacted by the court system, maybe has a date coming up or is on probation. One of the things that we do at Disability Rights New Jersey is provide that advocacy in the courtroom. Right now, we are specific to 2 counties in New Jersey, Mercer County and Essex County. And in those counties, Mercer County is the home to Trenton, New Jersey, which is our state capital. And Essex County is one of the most densely populated counties in our state. We do have plans to expand to other counties in the next few years. So we offer that technical assistance piece that I talked about earlier, again, to probation officers, public defenders, social workers, even the people who are assigned as mentors to our youth. And we'll talk to them about some strategies that they can use to really advocate for their youth with disabilities or disorders. We also work with police officers and court referees, which in New Jersey, a court referee is the diversion program in our state. So I just want to give you a brief example, a sprinkle of the work that Ruby and I do. I once had a client, we'll call her Lucy for today. She's 16 years old, and her twin were in our state system for over 10 years. Their mother's rights, parental rights, were terminated after 7 different short-term foster placements from the ages of 2 to 6. Lucy herself has significant mental health disorders and diagnoses, compounded by years of serious trauma and abuse. She was in a residential treatment facility at one point and was having a conflict with a group of girls. She asked one of the house resource workers if she could be moved to a different house. And that resource worker said, I can't do anything about it unless something actually really happens and I have to move one of you. And she took that to mean she was going to make something really happen. So she sat on her bed and she put a pile of clothes in the middle of her floor. She lit them on fire. She was charged with aggravated arson because she didn't show remorse and intentionally set her bedroom on fire while watching it burn around her, or that's what the court said. So Disability Rights New Jersey received this referral because we had to assist the public defender with some advocacy efforts around the diagnoses and the supports that Lucy really needed to be successful. Her public defender was able to get her released from the detention center to an out-of-home treatment facility, but plea negotiations were still at a standstill. So we were called again to consult on the matter. You see, the state of New Jersey wanted to charge her with aggravated arson, but aggravated arson in New Jersey is not expungible, which means it can never leave your record. And having that on your record actually makes it impossible to secure transitional or university housing. And this young girl, Lucy, through all of her trauma and obstacles with mental health, had a strong desire to go to college, and she would need somewhere to live. She also wanted to take advantage of some of the 18 and over state programs available to our foster youth. So we determined we could create a transition plan with her using a transition planning tool that our agency designed. And that we would be able to give to both the court and even her IEP team, her individualized education planning team at school. And it would have all the information needed to conceptualize her future. When you talk to Lucy and you were like, what do you want to do when you get older? She'd be like, I don't know. I'm not sure what I want to be. But once we broke down and asked her very specific questions, she had a really clear vision of what her future needed to look like. So we provided that information along with her clinical and educational evaluations to the public defender. That public defender was then able to successfully argue for her charges to be reduced and provided a mechanism for her to receive a commuted sentence, which means everything goes away, after she had a successful completion of probation. And now let's take a look. We also work with youth in the community as well. And because the process of working with youth in the community is youth-centered and family-focused, Both Ruby and I have had many barriers come up that our clients face, and we've had to brainstorm some creative solutions. So we're going to talk to you about those solutions today. We have identified that some family and youth have obstacles after we receive the referral to help them. How many times have you worked with a family that feels disorganized, unsure where they put really important documents, or maybe they're not even returning your phone calls or your emails? There are some families that can also be difficult to engage in the school community, in mental health services, and often families, by the time they get to us, have extreme signs of fatigue. See, the more times you come up against a barrier or an obstacle or a situation, defeat feels more likely to occur than success. So why bother? So our team worked to develop these strategies to help solve some of those obstacles when we're working with youth and families. We have a dedicated project email that's just for families, youth, and anyone involved in the team. So they don't have to go through all of the levels of intake to reach Ruby and I. Our referral process and our initial interview system also stands alone from all of the other intake calls. We use goal setting and specific funnel questioning. Again, that's the stuff I talked about with Lucy, where we start broad and we get really, really narrow with the questions that we're asking during an initial client interview. And we do that because many times the future is not even a thought beyond tomorrow. So direct questions can help to elicit responses about educational and community goals. During periods of instability, it's not uncommon to have holes in the narrative. So we gather information from multiple sources. After guardians sign releases, we start to contact other key community partners or stakeholders who have been involved in a young person's life. They might have more organized anecdotal notes or data that help us to inform our advocacy. And then we also very much recommend using face-to-face meetings and video meetings whenever possible. You know, the more you can connect and build rapport with youth, the greater the impact on advocacy. Many of our clients have a laundry list of people in their lives: social workers, state or government agencies, case managers, therapists, doctors, teachers, court stakeholders, probation officers, and so on. My clients have between 8 to 13 adults working on their team once they're involved with court. And that actually doesn't include any of the family members, their teachers, or child study team members. Despite the good intentions of having a large team of people, sometimes it's really overwhelming. And families still aren't aware of all of their rights and eligibility for community-based services like intensive counseling, music therapy, medication management, respite, behavioral assistance, or vocational or job training, or even social skills groups. Our project provides education on those services and helps the families get additional needed supports for those in-home services. It's also important to recognize who is ready to learn self-advocacy strategies and who needs to be guided through each step. At Disability Rights New Jersey, we prioritize that self-advocacy piece. We can analyze this when we're goal setting during the initial interview, and it helps us to dictate what type of services the family receives. Trauma-informed practices and client-centered counseling techniques also aid us in determining the continuum of services one youth might be eligible to get. Instead of just telling parents what to ask for or what to say when speaking with community partners, I actually offer to join parents on that call as a listening ear. Before the call, we develop strategies to know when to take breaks or when to speak privately about a matter. With youth, I practice those meetings, practice and role play, and it might feel silly and goofy at first, but it is so important, especially when the meetings involve concerns or tough topics that will be brought up. Youth are more likely to engage in the process if, one, the expectations are set before the meeting begins, and they can talk about what they're finding difficult. It's really hard to sit in a meeting where everyone is talking about you around you, and it is much easier to be open and receptive to new services if you're the one leading the conversation. It also helps our youth when things are written down in a checklist, so they know how long they have to stay focused for or how long they have to be invested in the meeting. And finally, we recommend that you create a rights-based booklet for youth specifically. There are many times that I've had a 15-year-old client show up for a meeting, but their mom, dad, legal guardian can't attend the meeting. I've also had siblings, older or younger siblings, fill in for the guardian or the parent. Youth need to understand their rights in special education and community supports just as much as the guardians do. So all of these strategies are really useful in the school-based advocacy arm of our project as well. So Ruby is going to walk you through some of the common barriers and issues we see in education and what we can do to tackle those.
So students with mental health concerns face many negative experiences in school, and these experiences make it much more likely that they will be impacted by the justice system. So some of these include an increased rate of suspension, increased school refusal and or truancy, a greater number of informal removals, and academic challenges. So I'm going to talk about each of these in turn. So we know that in general, students with disabilities are approximately twice as likely to be suspended throughout each school level compared to students without disabilities. We know that also these suspensions increase for students with mental health diagnoses. For example, students classified as emotionally disturbed had a suspension rate of 15.4%, which is more than 5 and about twice as high as the overall suspension rate for students with disabilities. And you can see in the chart here the disproportionality of that suspension rate for both in-school suspensions and for out-of-school suspensions, with generally students with disabilities being suspended at a much higher rate. So a close cousin to suspension is the process of informal removals. So informally removing students is essentially the way in which schools remove students by simply placing a phone call to the families and telling them that the student has to go home. This is not a suspension, but rather it's just a phone call to the family. And the problem with this type of removal is it evades special education protections and due process protections that students have to be in school. So because it circumvents federal law, students end up being disciplined or barred from class for behaviors related to their disability. Since the pandemic began, we know that parents of students with disabilities have said that this practice is on the rise. One increasingly common form of informal removals of students with disabilities is the requirement for mental health clearances to return to school. Again, these removals are really problematic because of the protections that they evade and because of the fact that very few states regulate this practice. Some advocates say that school officials, because specifically now post-pandemic, because they are understaffed and overwhelmed by the mental health problems of students, have begun relying on these types of clearances as a way to quickly remove the most difficult special education students. We also know that students with mental health concerns, specifically students with mental health concerns who are not receiving the appropriate in-class and in-school supports to manage those issues, are more likely to engage in maladaptive behaviors that lead to both suspension and informal removal. So the next issue I wanted to talk about was school refusal and truancy. So school refusal is often associated with students with mental health diagnoses. It is defined as the disorder of a child who refuses to go to school on a regular basis or has problems staying in school. It is often a symptom of broader mental health disorders and may be associated with diagnoses such as social anxiety disorder, generalized anxiety disorder, specific phobias, major depression, oppositional defiant disorder, post-traumatic stress disorder, among others. So school refusal is often confused or associated with truancy, but there's a difference between the two. So truancy is a situation where a student skips school, often without the parent's knowledge, whereas school refusal is where a student is actively expressing anxieties or other challenges that make it difficult to attend school. But as you can imagine, often students who are labeled truant are really struggling with mental health issues, and they are just not able to verbalize exactly what is preventing them from attending school. So instead of receiving any types of services or supports, they are labeled as truant. So mental health issues among students not only lead to increased school exclusion and refusal, but they also lead to greater academic difficulties. Research suggests that depression is associated with a lower grade point average and that co-occurring depression and anxiety can increase this association. And ultimately, coping with the impact of mental health can interfere with cognitive processes required for classroom learning. Over time, these cognitive processes can affect academic achievement, and some ways in which untreated mental health issues impact students is through difficulty controlling attention during tasks, trouble persevering during challenging academic tasks, trouble recalling academic information, slowed problem solving, trouble completing homework, reduction in standardized achievement test scores, and a lower end of the year grades. So school exclusion and refusal, as well as academic challenges, work together to increase the likelihood of justice involvement. Students who do not receive supports in school will continue to struggle academically, while students who are not attending school, either for refusal or removal, will not only fall behind academically, but also form a negative attitude towards school and detach socially and emotionally from teachers and peers. Together, these two negative pressures of academic struggle and school exclusion make it more likely that students will skip school, engage in more disruptive behaviors, lead to more suspensions, and continue to decline academically and possibly drop out, all of which increases the chances of being impacted by the juvenile justice system. Through the Youth Justice Project, our work helps to disrupt the downward spiral, and essentially we try and help to pull students back out of the pipeline. So educational advocacy helps interrupt the cycle of academic failure and increased exclusionary discipline. And we address academic failure through advocacy efforts focused on reviewing an IEP to identify problems with services or supports that lead to academic difficulties, determining if a change in placement is warranted, or requesting additional evaluations to identify student needs. So just as Regina mentioned when she discussed community services, there are many barriers and challenges in providing educational advocacy to the population we serve as well. These barriers, again, range from personal and family circumstances to structural and systemic issues within the schools. Regina already discussed some of the family circumstances and barriers, as well as strategies to overcome them. So I want to discuss specific strategies for school-based advocacy. Some of the barriers specific to school advocacy are the distrust of the school system, difficulty understanding the IEP process, challenges in assisting youth re-entering schools after removal. And for all of these, our work requires educating families on their rights and their children's rights to receive a free and appropriate public education. Our work also focuses on advocating directly for services and supports to help students become more successful in school, including advocating for behavioral intervention plans to address challenging behaviors that usually lead to suspensions, and related services like counseling, transition planning tools to help youth prepare for their future, and compensatory education to address gaps that are often created by ineffective IEPs. So I am now going to turn it over to Abir, who is going to discuss post-K through 12 services and supports for justice-impacted youth. We would like you all to hold the questions until the end of Abir's presentation, at which point we would be happy to answer any questions that you have. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks so much, Ruby. I'm going to start my screen share in a sec to share my presentation. Good afternoon, everyone. My name is Abir Sikder. That's Abir like the drink. I'm a brown-skinned Bengali American man with black hair and glasses. I'm wearing an indigo shirt and a gray-blue blazer. I go by any pronouns, and I'm coming to you live from New Orleans, Louisiana, from a hotel room where, and I've been here stuffing myself with gumbo and jambalaya. Today, I'll be talking about transition services and activities for justice-involved youth and young adults with disabilities. A little bit about my background in this work. I went to, before my time at the Council of State Governments, where I currently work, I attended GW Law School. While I've never actually practiced law or took the bar, I did, during my time there, I worked for a district attorney in New York, worked for the Innocence Project, and also for a county judge and for the ACLU. And before that time, I was a math teacher for 3 years through Teach for America at Memphis, Tennessee, where I served students in one of the poorest neighborhoods in Memphis, and North Memphis and Fraser specifically. And I had various students, and unfortunately, sad to say, have students who went on to be just as impacted after my time with them, and who were at the time as well. But before I go too deep into the Justice Youth presentation, I want to talk about what I'm representing. It's a collaboration called CAPE Youth. That's the Center for Advancing Policy on Employment for Youth. We're a partnership between the U.S. Department of Labor's Office of Disability Employment Policy, ODEP for short. There are federal grant funders, and the Council of State Governments, where I mentioned, that's where I work. At CSG, we're the nation's only nonpartisan organization that works to support all 3 branches of state government across the 50 states and the 4 territories. We work in all areas of public policy, and we have regional offices across the country. I work at our headquarters in Lexington, Kentucky, where I'm from. And specifically, I'm on the education and workforce team. But that's this part of CAPE Youth, or also a partnership between CSG and then the Yang Tan Institute on Employment and Disability at Cornell University. My co-author for the work I'll be talking about today, and who's usually co-presenting with me, but he couldn't make it, Matt Sala. He works for the Yang Tan Institute as a senior research associate, and he's also research director of Cornell's Criminal Justice Employment Initiative. And I'll be sharing his contact information at the end as well. At CSG, we provide some of the more policy background, whereas Yang Tan at Cornell, more of the academic in-depth research. And what we do at CAPE Youth, we seek to improve employment outcomes for youth and young adults with disabilities by helping states build their capacity in their youth service delivery and workforce systems. We do this through professional development, through strategic partnerships, through evidence-based practices, and then by sharing those best practices across the states. We really like to emphasize, hey, what are states or localities or territories doing that they can learn from each other? What are some unique things California can learn from Kentucky? What can Kentucky learn from Louisiana? Things like that. And we try to bring state policymakers, state leaders together. That's elected officials, executives, administrators, judges, also subject matter experts, people with lived experience, across all fields, not just education and workforce, but disability services, healthcare, anything related to this topic, youth advocacy, bring them together for meetings, for discussions, to share ideas and learn from each other, and of course, inform CAPE Youth's work. So I'll be talking about a brief. We have 2 research briefs, coming out later this year on justice-involved youth that lay out policy considerations and state examples. I will talk really briefly about the first one on rehab and recovery. That one overlaps a lot with what Regina and Ruby said, so I'm not going to spend too much time on that, but I just do want to give the basic overview of that. But the purpose of our research briefs are to provide state and local examples of policies that serve justice-involved youth with disabilities. And some of the key themes are looking at holistic support and coordinated care, looking at reducing recidivism, looking at mitigating barriers to education and employment, and examining how we can support successful long-term outcomes. I really want to emphasize the second bullet for a sec, recidivism. I want everyone to pause for a sec and just say that word, please, recidivism. One more time, please say that word, think about it. And what that means is the tendency for a person to reoffend, to recommit criminal behavior. And a key theme I'll be talking about in today's presentation, it's not the only theme, but one I want to emphasize, is how when you reduce recidivism, you increase the likelihood that young people with disabilities, that young people in general, and that frankly, anyone in the justice system, when you reduce recidivism, when you reduce their likelihood, when you find ways to keep them from becoming re-involved in the system, you increase their opportunities for economic opportunities. You increase their likelihood that they will get a job, that they will succeed, that they will have long-term employment, and that they will get paid above the poverty line as well. And I want you to think of the reverse of that as well. When you increase justice-involved youth with disabilities, or just people in general justice system, when you increase their access to educational opportunities, to employment supports, to opportunities for employment, to higher pay, you reduce their likelihood to reoffend, to re-enter the criminal justice system. So those are the key themes. Again, we have 2 policy briefs. The first one's on rehab and recovery. Second one's on educational economic support. I'll be focusing mostly on the second one, but I will briefly talk about the first one. Again, this overlaps a lot with what Regina and Ruby were talking about. But with that brief, we're looking at how the justice system is meant to provide opportunities for recovery and rehabilitation. But often youth with disabilities experience multiple challenges during their incarceration that hinder rehabilitation, that limit their opportunities for healing, and that create barriers in their eventual transitions to employment. But by offering more holistic support and coordinated care, justice facilities and the justice system overall can potentially be a much safer and more supportive environment for these youth by focusing on restorative practices that help them prepare for and advance their educational and workforce goals. And the policy considerations we highlight in that brief, and they're more detailed. We have multiple state examples to reflect each one. The first one's expanding initial screening to address individualized needs, so screening for disabilities, screening for mental health disorders, things like that. The second one is replacing punitive isolation practices with recovery practices, the key example there being solitary confinement. Number 3 is looking at developing cultural competency training to address intersectionality. As Ruby and Regina talked about, there's an unfortunate high rate of people with people of color who are incarcerated in the justice system. So looking at that as one example. Also, the overlap of the high rate of LGBTQ individuals, the high rate of disability. In fact, it's somewhere between 30 to 60% is the national estimate of how many people with disabilities are involved in the juvenile justice system. And it's concerning to think, why is there such a large range? Like, why do we say 30 to 60? Why isn't the number more accurate? Something to think about. And last is about implementing trauma-informed practices to address unresolved psychological needs. Again, that brief will be coming out in the next few months. I shared a short brief that's kind of a primer on those bigger briefs coming out that does talk about this in a bit more detail. But let me focus on educational and economic access. So with this second brief, which will also be coming out later in the year, we're looking at how youth in the system are less likely to access higher education and employment services. We're looking at how youth and adults with disabilities in the system, how when they enter the workforce, even when they are able to successfully enter the workforce, they're often in the lowest paying and more short-term positions. They don't have, they don't really get career. They just get they get short-term jobs. They get low wages. The majority are below the poverty line. Furthermore, those who can access employment more immediately or sooner after return to higher education, as they exit the system, are much more likely to have successful transitions back to their community, back to their schools, back to their homes, back to their families, and they're less likely to reoffend. Again, what was that key word, that key R word? Please say it. Recidivism. That's the key theme of that third bullet there. But overall, with this brief, we will present policy considerations that help states improve these employment opportunities. And specifically, they'll talk about these themes here. We want to think about with higher education, how youth and young adults, particularly both youth and young adults and students with disabilities, both those groups individually, are more likely to drop out of school and experience academic failures. And then more specifically, just involved with disabilities are also more likely to drop out of school and experience academic failure, unfortunately. And there's just various procedural barriers and issues they face. And even when they can have some limited success in employment, they still have high rates of poverty. Again, low pay, limited retention, limited opportunities for true career, having a true career, something long term. And the 3 policy considerations, they're listed here. And with these, we're looking at the ways that approaches that states and localities can take to support youth with disabilities in preparing them for employment and transitions, and helping them access and participate in education, in workforce opportunities, both during their time in the justice system and after their time in the system as well. And we do that to, as a way of mitigating the negative things that prevent their long-term successful outcomes. And again, we want to, these will be things I talk about that you want to start while someone's in the system, ideally from day one, but you also want to help them transition. You want to continue these things, have opportunities for workforce training, for work-based learning, for schooling, things like that. And while they're in the system and as a transition now. And then of course you want to continue that even after they're out of the system, you still want to continue them. The things I'll be talking about here are increasing access and connecting students to higher education, incentivizing participation in training programs and work opportunities, and removing general barriers to employment by limiting exclusionary policies. So here, talking about higher education, of course, education at any level is an important thing to consider for justice-involved youth. With CAPE Youth's focus, when we talk about youth and young adults, we're talking about students age 16 to 24. That's the range we focus on, because at the age of 16 in most states, that's where you're able to access some form of full-time employment or close to that. And then of course 24 is closer to the age, maybe the latest age where you theoretically enter the workforce or potentially finish school. or grad school or something like that. But that's the age range we focus on. So that's why I'm focusing a bit more on higher education specifically here. But overall, justice-involved youth, particularly those with disabilities, just involvement in the system, it leads to numerous interruptions to someone's educational opportunities and to their secondary education progress. These interruptions, can simply include transitioning from schooling to a juvenile facility, between short-term and long-term facilities, because there's different kinds of detention in juvenile facilities, and of course, going back from those facilities back to school, being sent to an alternative school, being sent to a camp, going back to your family, going back from your family to juvie. Various transitions often happen, and various youth, unfortunately, they will likely have more than one of those transitions. Think of a student in general. If any of you have ever had to move for school or move for a job, think of how hard that was by itself. So you can imagine how much harder it is for a young person of this age suffering in the system, having these multiple transitions. Just imagine how hard that is. But with this topic, we want to highlight how states can address disruptions and interruptions that youth face, and they can do this. They can mitigate these disruptions by creating pathways to higher education to promote socioeconomic mobility and just connect students to successful reentry outcomes by reducing, I know you're all saying it, by reducing recidivism. So to mitigate the negative impacts of these academic interruptions, states can simply, connect students to higher education. And we know that justice-involved youth with disabilities, and just youth overall, and merely not just even youth, adults too, who achieve higher levels of education are more likely to access work opportunities. This includes CTE, career and technical education, work-based learning, internships, apprenticeships, and also just long-term career opportunities as well. And they're also more likely to experience higher rates and more stable rates of employment, higher rates of retention, staying in the workforce, higher rates of pay, and then lower rates of, I know you're saying it, lower rates of recidivism. Specific considerations here include financial aid. So looking at how justice-involved youth, they often experience difficulty with navigating the college application process, particularly related to financial aid. I think all students, parents and guardians, face this too, figuring out financial aid, the different aspects of it, expecting a young person to be able to figure this out. And we're talking about justice-involved youth. They may not have the family connections to the network, so they have to kind of figure it out on their own. A young person usually doesn't know how this works. How does money work? I don't know if most adults know properly how money works. I'm still in debt from law school and still figuring out how to pay off my student loans. But here we want to look at how states can help justice-involved youth both better understand these resources and then just access them. Not just access general resources, but access guides and useful things, and access the right people, the right counselors, the right advisors, the right experts that can help them. And second, we have here is mentoring and counseling. And here we're looking at how states and local justice programs can coordinate with different kinds of programs like colleges, campus support networks, academic centers, to provide trained mentors and counselors who can guide justice-involved youth during their transition out of high school. And I emphasize, educational ones. These can, of course, be volunteer groups, advocacy groups, of course, justice-involved programs themselves. But here I'm emphasizing a bit more on the educational aspect because we're talking about higher education. But mentorship itself has been shown to be a really best practice for youth, all populations of youth and young adults. It's been shown to be even more hyper useful, even more effective for those with disabilities and for those involved in the justice system, and along with students of color, those who are in the foster care, those who have eating disorders. Kind of imagine any kind of marginalized group. Mentorship has been shown to have even more positive aspects for any marginalized group. And with this, we want to look at partnerships between the public sector, between the government, between post-secondary programs, and also community service providers and even volunteer programs, as I mentioned, and how they can offer justice-involved youth exposure to safer and newer environments that really focus on, their personal growth that affects their academic growth, help them reimagine their goals, help them, re-perceive, or help them deal with self-perception and shedding negative labels. And again, mentoring itself, but mentoring particularly in education and higher education settings, is a very promising model for workforce development. And the brief I'll publish later this year will have more details on that. And the last consideration we have here is in-demand career education. So this is pretty simple, looking at how states can collaborate specifically with institutions of higher ed to initiate learning and experiences that are geared toward in-demand jobs in their state. That can be information technology, that can be manufacturing, it can be STEM jobs, it can be agriculture, just what's in that state or in that region, in that locality. And specifically, states can target partnerships with employers and sectors that offer more opportunities for justice involved individuals and or opportunities for individuals with disabilities. Certain programs are out there that say, hey, we are looking to hire, we're looking for people who are re-entering re-entry programs, people who are formerly involved in the system. We're looking to hire them. Or there's what are sometimes called model employers, and that can be a model employer for anything. But like if you look at the state as a model employer, that's a policy brief we have in a separate program at CSG, but that's looking at how states can be, a model employer specifically for individuals with disabilities as well. And now I'm going to talk about some state examples that reflect these considerations. Here I have two from California, one for financial aid, one for mentoring and counseling. And these are hyperlinked to the presentation. I think you all have access to the presentation. If you don't, I can share it after. And again, we'll have more details on these in the brief coming out later this year. The first example is the California Student Aid Commission created a financial aid guide for youth with juvenile justice involvement. That's the title of it. And it did this in partnership with a really great program called the Youth Law Center. This guide is for justice-involved youth and young adults who are about to graduate from high school and or who are under the age of 26. And it just covers the basics of financial aids, of specific state grants and scholarships. It presents resources for youth, not just for those in the justice system, but for those with multi-systems involvement. Unfortunately, there's a high overlap of youth who are involved in the justice system, also involved in child welfare and or involved in foster care and or involved in identify as homeless. And then also if you're involved in the juvenile justice system, you're unfortunately more likely to be involved in the criminal justice system as an adult. So, it looks at that holistically. It's like, hey, you may need these resources, these connections to all kinds of systems. It also, it's really amazing, this guide. Like, I've read it. It starts out, here's definition of financial aid. Here's money available. Here's some basics, but also it thinks about it really holistically. It also gives guidance on communicating with social workers, with independent living programs, and with academic and personal counselors for both educational and personal needs. And it even gives details to distinguish how things like drug-related offenses and convictions may or may not affect your financial aid. It's just a very step-by-step guide. And honestly, it's useful, I would say, for youth, as I mentioned, involved in other systems. And just kind of maybe even for any student in California, at least where it's designed for. I think a lot of students could just use it, at least for the basics of financial aid. But that's one there. And then the next one is the Rising Scholar Network, which was created by California Assembly Bill 417, I think in 2021. And this network is for California community colleges for that state public run program. And I do want to note, I'm talking about higher education here, not just talking about college and university. We're also talking about community colleges as well. And this network supports students who are impacted by the justice system by connecting them with colleges, including community colleges, and specifically colleges with programs that include peer mentorships that are specifically catered to people who are formerly incarcerated. They also include degree programs located within correctional facilities, and they also have on-campus support specifically at these colleges for justice-involved youth. So they have programs in the correctional facilities and on the campuses, the school campuses. And furthermore, funding for these programs, it's a community college fund, it's a Rising Scholar Fund for mentoring and counseling, but the funding is flexible to a degree. Program funding that's given to community colleges can also provide mental health support, social services support, and even housing assistance, because you want to think about these needs holistically. That all affects your outcomes, that all affects your opportunities for education, and that all relates to mentorship and counseling as well. Some more examples I have up here. One's from South Carolina, one's from Oregon. In South Carolina, their Department of Juvenile Justice operates its own school district with fully accredited academic and career and technical education programs that serve approximately 500 students that are grades 4 through 12. So again, its own school district, 500 students, all the way grades 4 through 12. And the program DJJ, the Department of Juvenile Justice, they even host a young craftsman program with apprenticeship programs for welding classes, several on and off campus employment opportunities. So these are opportunities on that school district campus and also at employer sites themselves, and opportunities for career readiness, including career readiness programs that are catered toward in-demand and high-need industries in South Carolina. Furthermore, their Career Readiness Center promotes education and workforce development with specific kinds of skills training and workforce credentialing. Again, apprenticeship programs, certifications, and credentials, licensing, they even have connections for that. Furthermore, they partner with Allen University, a university in South Carolina, to also offer college credit for completion of these programs and scholarship opportunities and financial aid. Furthermore, they partner with state and local initiatives to provide holistic wraparound programs that focuses on justice involved youth, and that they try to involve youth, make sure that youth are involved in kind of leaders that are involved in all elements of their treatment plans and their career plans as well. As Regina mentioned in her, in her presentation, that's a really important aspect to think about. You want to bring the youth themselves to the table. You want to, have them talk about like, hey, here's what I need for my treatment. Here's what I'm facing. And like, here are my career plans. Let me have a say in my own destiny. So I just really wanted to highlight that aspect of DJJ. Next, we have the Oregon Youth Authority, OYA for short. And they partner with Oregon's Department of Education to contract with school districts to provide CTE, online learning, dual credit courses, apprenticeships, and even professional trade certifications. They also have a lot of programming that focus on IEP and special education as well for OYA. Next, I'm going to talk about my second policy consideration up here, which is on incentivizing participation in training programs and work opportunities as well. And here we want to think about how there's really limited opportunities for skills development for justice involved youth. As I mentioned, there's limits to how much they can participate in these things. There's limited retention in these programs. Even when they're part of programs, there's limited opportunities for their skills development as well. I'm going to pause for a sec because I need to reorganize my notes. Excuse me. Sorry, I dropped a couple of papers and I'm trying to figure out where this page is. Okay, sorry about that. There we go. Considerations we have here. One are earn to learn programs. Sometimes they're called learn and earn, earn and learn, similar names, you'll hear that. But those are just programs that like, you literally, you complete a certain learning certification, you complete a certain academic program, you earn money as you go. They're of course related to certain apprenticeship and CTE opportunities. And then you also want to look at skills training related to individualized needs as well. And here's some state examples. I'm going to highlight South Carolina again. They have an earn and return accountability program where justice involved youth just earn as they go for certain certifications, certain completion things. They get paid stipends as they go in these programs. And they also have with the accountability, they make sure hey, you're actually completing the programs, you're completing certain personal goals as well. But basically it's looking at paid opportunities. Next is Employ Milwaukee. This is a local example. And this is specifically done by, it's called Employment Milwaukee, but it's the Workforce Development Board of Milwaukee County in Wisconsin. They offer various also earn and learn programs, paid opportunities, reentry programs. They look at the holistic needs as well, and they provide financial incentives for formerly incarcerated individuals to enter the workforce system and to enter the workforce, I should say. Two more we have here. One is in Georgia, the Work Readiness Enrichment Program. That's done in Catham County, Georgia. And there they just focus on academic opportunities and basic training for students. They partner with academic programs, and they even partner with, similar to South Carolina, they partner with wraparound support programs across the state as well. And that's a model being done in one county, but they're looking at modeling it throughout different counties in the states as well. And then one example we have here is from an organization called Growing Change, and they partner specifically with North Carolina's Department of Corrections in the state to provide their programming. But they're a work-based learning site in North Carolina. It's actually a former prison site that they turn into a farm area. And they provide agriculturally focused work-based learning and service learning opportunities. Students learn about farming, about agricultural entrepreneurship. and even agricultural science as well. Yeah, so they have various programs, and they include, it's very holistic. They also include trauma-informed care programs. This was founded by a former social worker. I guess still currently a social worker, but worked full-time as a social worker before, Mr. Norrin Sanford. He's a former social worker, and he looks at bringing trauma-informed practices. And things they do are like they have the students come together in groups, and they discuss like trauma-informed care. They discuss race-based trauma they face and look at historical trauma they face, and they look at intersectionality as well. And they also have a paid stipend program. It's similar to the ones I mentioned, Earn and Learn, but it's not just focused on academic opportunities. They give paid stipends for various things like, oh, you found a job opportunity, you get a paid stipend for that. You completed part one of it, you get a paid stipend. You completed this full workforce learning opportunity, you get a paid stipend. But also even for mentoring programs like, hey, you found a mentor, paid stipend. You had your first meeting with them, paid stipend. You set up a life goal plan with them, paid stipend. You set up a career plan with them, paid stipend. So just want to focus on, the opportunities to provide paid learning opportunities and just, paid things, particularly for youth. I mean, young people are incentivized by money. They need money. It's just a really successful way of looking at that and how you can provide those financial things in a wraparound sense. And last but not least, this one's focusing on removing barriers to employment by limiting exclusionary policies. And issues we have here are with juvenile and criminal records and background checks. Even in states where you're not allowed to access someone's records, there are kinds of ways of asking about it and still backdoor ways of accessing it, of course. So looking at ways to prevent that and looking at general procedural roadblocks. I mean, sometimes it's simple as, oh, you have to list a criminal or juvenile offense you committed, and then that's automatically disqualifies you from certain jobs. And considerations we have here are clean slate initiatives. These are where, after someone remains crime-free for X number of years, state by state, there are different cases, or a judge may have certain autonomy in determining it. After a couple of years, you have a clean slate, you stay crime-free, you reduce recidivism. You get your record wiped clean, or at least part of it. And I think one thing that can be considered in these are successful educational and workforce things. I don't think most states do this, but just like, oh, hey, part of the clean slate is like, hey, I see that you've entered into a schooling or academic program or a work-based learning program. You got a job. Maybe I will factor that in for your clean slate. Normally, it says under state law 5 years. Maybe we can reduce that to 4 years, given that you've successfully done this thing. Another consideration is ban the box and fair chance laws, and these are going to eliminating certain questionnaires. Preventing employers from actually just asking the question about ask someone about their former criminal behavior. And also, not just that, also asking institutions of higher education, colleges, community colleges, from asking that as well, because sometimes that's required to answer on college applications, even on financial aid applications. I do want to note with things like this, I think a lot of states have exceptions for certain, major crimes, often violent crimes, sexual crimes, things like that. So I think there are those, I think, certain obvious exceptions that will differ state by state that you'd want to report. And examples we have here are Michigan. They have a clean slate law. I believe it's after 7 years. They just factor in if someone's been crime free for X amount of time, they will remove access to someone's record. And then another one's in Arizona. They have a fair chance law that's similar to that. That's about banning questionnaires, questions about asking someone in workforce and college programs about former juvenile record. And they also include as part of it, they actually have a workforce training program. I think they're in early steps of actually developing it, but they actually have a workforce training program that's included as part of the fair chance law. I do want to know these examples. I'll go back a slide for a sec. This is more the focus of CSG. We actually have a justice center. So again, I'm here on behalf of CSG's Youth Policy Center, known as CAPE Youth, but we actually have a national criminal justice center that's focused on criminal justice reform policy across all 50 states. If you just Google CSG Justice Center, you'll find them. They're headquartered in New York City, but they have various policy briefs on this in particular and on criminal justice reform related to education and employment, which is my focus, and just related to criminal justice reform, that topic overall across all 50 states. So I'd recommend checking them out. Here I've linked to some of CAPE Youth's resources. Again, they're linked here. We have a brief on improving mental health service delivery. We're working on a follow-up brief to be published later this year that will continue that work and specifically focus on mental health equity for students of color. We have a brief on trauma-informed policy. As I mentioned, trauma-informed care is something really important to focus on for young people in the justice system, as is mental health service delivery. We have our brief on intersectionality. We actually have two briefs on this topic. One's on program implementation. That was published last year, and one's on program design, just published last month. But there we're looking at youth with intersecting identities, so youth who are youth of color, disabilities, involved in the justice system, involved in foster care, things like that. We have our CTE brief. That's about career and technical education opportunities for students with disabilities. It talks a lot about CTE during COVID. And then we have our apprenticeship brief, which focuses on fostering inclusive apprenticeships and career pathways for youth with disabilities. Again, these are all linked, and we actually have more policy briefs on our website at capeyouth.org, which is up here. But if you have any questions, you can contact me at this thing, and this should be available. You can contact me or my colleague, Matt Sala, at Cornell University, and here's our social media as well. Thank you for your time, and I'll pass it back to Tracy to moderate Q&A.
Thank you so much. It was such an amazing presentation. All three of you provided really amazing information. So thank you all very much. So we do have just a few minutes for some Q&As. Just first, I saw in the chat and in the Q&A questions about whether the slide deck would be available. That is available. You can find it under the resources tab. If you go back to the reception area of the website, click resources, you'll be able to find all of the slide decks there. The next question was for Regina and Ruby. Could you share the strengths assessment tool that you discussed?
Yes, so wonderful news about that. New Jersey is hopefully weeks away from publishing it on our website for anyone to access and use. So what we recommend doing so that we share the most updated version with you and give you the best sense of a resource is to email Ruby and I, and then we can share that directly with you. But it will be public on our website in a few weeks is our hope.
Awesome. Thank you so much. The other question is from Erica Saudi, and I'll put that up here. Oh, you can't see it all. Erica, would you like to join us on stage and you can ask the question? Are you joining us, Erica? Oh, there it is. So she says, I work with the Juvenile Justice Coalition in Ohio.
Here we go.
One of our main goals. Oh, there you are.
It was asking me like 8,000 questions. Sorry. So I'm with the Juvenile Justice Coalition here in Ohio, and one of our main goal is to close all youth prisons, obviously, but one of our goals leading up to that is to redirect into community-centered alternatives. And I'm wondering if you see trends towards better academic care and more nuance in academic care for the children in those less restrictive environments than in the detention center or prison settings.
So Erica, I can talk a little bit about this, but in New Jersey, every county kind of deals with this in a different way. For our youth who are not placed in the juvenile, prisons, as we call them, they're often in group homes or placements within the community where they attend the local public schools. So yes, I mean, we believe that those are better as long they're as good, let's just say, as the other public schools, but we still have the same challenges of these youth receiving the appropriate services, but better for them to be within that local public school system than within the juvenile prisons. So that's at least how we see it in Essex County, where I focus my work. Regina, if you want to talk a little bit, if you have anything to add about how Mercer County might do it a little differently.
Erica, I loved how you clarified about it being a more nuanced set of services. I think that hits the nail on the head. When you move back into the community-based setting or you advocate for that push to community-based services, there are larger academic opportunities opened. Another barrier that we see less when they are in the community than in detention centers or our juvenile system is that their behavioral, maladaptive behaviors that might happen on the unit trickle into the educational setting in detention centers. So they lose access to education, even though constitutionally they're not allowed. They might be in isolation, or they might be on room restriction, and then they don't access education that same way. They also have less of a continuum of services. So a youth who really would benefit from a social skills goal or goals about vocational rehabilitation or job training, those might be less likely to occur in the juvenile system. And then what Ruby's talking about is that when you push them back to the community where they belong and where it is less traumatic, you have different barriers. And so what we like people to understand is that the push to community, the advocacy can't stop there. Because dropping a youth off into the community and not providing them with the assurance that their education system is fully supported is a recipe for disaster. And so we had in New Jersey this big push to get everyone back home, and then provided them without any services and supports along the way once they were home and they landed back in detention. So we absolutely encourage everyone to push for those community placements and that community options, diversion away from the carceral setting, but to do so with as much services and supports as you would give to someone who's in the system.
Great. Thank you all very much. Oh, Abir, did you have something you wanted to add?
Yeah, that's one idea. I agree totally with what Regina and Ruby said. I think definitely nationally, just for youth in general involved in the system, yes, that community-based care, it's more useful for them, and especially for those with disabilities. The juvenile justice system is not really inclusive of them. I mean, just as I mentioned, the high rate of disabilities, the high number, the high rate of invisible disabilities, co-occurring disabilities, that's just something the justice system cannot comprehend or address. And when we're talking about the broad array of community-based care and community alternatives, with all those systems out there, you're just more likely to find what these, what a young people needs, what access they need. I will note, I do think it is still important, though, as I mentioned in my presentation, you do want to think about still making a juvenile justice facility, yes, a safer place. I don't think that can always be done, but you want to work on that transition. And I think a lot of states, no state system is honestly very good, but there are major reforms happening to address that and to, potentially provide that community-based care in a sense and connect it with the system, or even provide it in the system or while someone's in the system, of course. So I do think we just want to think about that as well. Thank you for the question.
Thank you. And Abir, Regina, Ruby, thank you so much for being here today and for taking the time to prepare the presentation and share your experience and your expertise. I know I learned a lot, and I'm sure all of the rest of the attendees did as well. To those of you who attended, thank you for being here. Please take 30 seconds and complete that evaluation. All you have to do is click on the little blue box at the top of your chat box or the next to the last icon on your vertical bar. It'll just ask you 3 quick questions, and that just gives us some information so that will help our planning for next time. Our next session starts at the top of the hour. Jane Singer will be speaking about a developmental relational perspective to trauma and healing when working with both adults and children. Between now and then, we invite you to take a break, get a drink of water, scope out some of those resources. We also have the lightning talks available at the booths. And so just go to the reception, click at the top where it says booths. I watched Rick Yang yesterday talk about high achieving schools and his mental health journey being at a high achieving school and how his needs are kind of overlooked. And it was a really interesting presentation. I encourage everybody to go and scope out some of those lightning talks. Go through some of the booths. Sometimes you'll see exhibitors already there. And so you can have a chat with some of the booth exhibitors about what they do, how they do it, and get access to additional resources. Thank you all again for being here. Thank you to our presenters. Again, the next session starts at the top of the hour. Thanks so much. Bye-bye.